My name is Susan Gerard, and my presentation is The Immigrants in Chicago, the Irish Influence of the City of Chicago. In a short time of the history of the United States, the city of Chicago grew to be one of the most important and largest cities east of the Mississippi. The personality of the city of Chicago was molded and shaped by the cultures and personalities of the immigrants who came to Chicago in search of a better life. Most of the immigrants who came to Chicago were escaping poverty, strife, or seeking religious freedom. People came from all over the world. Chicago is the home of the second largest Polish population outside of Poland. The Germans came, the Russians came, the Swedes, and the Chinese. The Irish, however, had the largest impact on the city of Chicago into this century through politics and the Catholic Church. The place, which is now Chicago, was first established 100 years before the American Revolution. Frenchman Jesuit Jacques Marquette and philosophy student and fur trader Louis Joliet came to the place that is now Chicago in 1673 during a voyage to spread Christianity westward into the wilderness. The first permanent settlement, however, was not established for another 100 years when Jean-Baptiste Pont du Sable, an American of Caribbean birth, built a home at the mouth of the Chicago River to serve as a trading post for the French-Canadian voyageur trappers. Shortly afterward, the United States built Fort Dearborn to protect the area from the British, who were still not happy with the outcome of the American Revolution. When Chicago was officially incorporated in 1833, the population was a few hundred. By 1860, the population had grown to over 112,000. The growth was greatly facilitated by the very immigrants seeking refuge and prosperity in the United States. By the middle of the 19th century, the Chicago's population was growing by 20% every decade. Half of the population in Chicago was foreign-born by 1847, and nearly 1/5 of those were Irish-born. Irish immigrants sought a life in a larger city due to the abundance of employment with railroads, stockyards, and factories. By 1870, the population was almost 300,000, and of those, 40,000 were Irish immigrants. The first wave of Irish immigrants came to escape unimaginable poverty created in Ireland during the British occupation. Ireland was said to be a country where the entire native population were paupers in 1830. Half of the population lived in windowless huts. The Irish had been driven from their land by the British and were forced to rent back the land that had once been theirs. To increase the rent earned, the land was subdivided into smaller and smaller portions. There was no industry to employ people. For survival, the Irish grew potatoes. The event that sent 1.5 million Irish born in search of a better life elsewhere, however, was the blight on their main means of substance, the potato. In 1847, not a single potato that was grown was edible. The only means of survival was gone for the natives of Ireland. Canada was supplying timber for the building of England, and the ships that left Canada for England returned full of immigrants looking for a better life. Chicago was not entirely welcoming to the new immigrants due to the fears that Catholicism would make them loyal to the Pope, but not to the United States. They came anyway. Due to the possibilities of employment, the middle of the 19th century, Chicago had become a railroad hub and had joined the established eastern cities with great expansion to the west. Chicago was a natural location for this development due to its access to rivers. In 1865, the Union stockyards were built to process livestock to be transported to feed the eastern populations. Trains brought livestock to the west and into the stockyards to deliver to the adjacent meat packing plants. One did not need to be educated to work in the stockyards, only to need to earn a living and desire to feed your family. The Irish identity in Chicago brought from their homeland the Catholic identity of the Irish was inseparable from the people themselves. Even today, 1/3 of the population of Chicago is Catholic. Catholic parishes in Chicago were established by those immigrants who spoke the language of their native homes. Germans and the French had German and French parishes, which would link them to their culture. Due to the Irish being English speakers, all of the Catholic churches in Chicago became Catholic Irish parishes. The Irish dominated the Catholic Church in Chicago, with all Catholic bishops being of Irish descent until 1916. The Catholic Church in Chicago was built today through building of churches and schools. When a church and an associated school were built, they became a cornerstone of a neighborhood and lent respectability to the area. As the Irish began moving away from the neighborhoods of their parents or grandparents, they took their church and school building with them further into the communities. For Irish immigrants who had come from an unforgiving poverty and used to living in thatch huts, for worship, building beautiful churches was a way for them to show that their lives had improved beyond measure. And there was no better way to improve a life than to build a church, improve an area, pardon me. The famine was the primary reason for the mass exodus from Ireland in the 1840s and 1850s, but the lives of Irish citizens under British rule had been appalling for centuries. Since the 12th century, the British had used Ireland as a trophy of invasion and the Irish people as virtual slaves. Beginning in the 1860s, campaigns were begun in Ireland to remove the British from the land. Those who had come to Chicago had supported the Fenian Brotherhood, a national organization created to push them out of Ireland, the British out of Ireland. The Fenian Brotherhood, composed of American Civil War veterans, plotted to invade Canada to use it as a bargaining chip to get the British out of Ireland. The Brotherhood had several skirmishes in Chicago, but were never, in Canada, but were never successful in their campaigns. The lack of the success of the Fenian Brotherhood led to its disbanding, but the desire to help the homeland did not diminish for those of Irish descent in Chicago, where they would hold rallies and contribute money to the Irish Free State once partition was established. Clan na Gael replaced the Fenian Brotherhood, and in Chicago the association would be the beginnings of a second forum in which the Irish would influence the formation of Chicago of today. The desire to help the homeland led to a political interest that would steer Chicago politics into the next century. Beginning after the Civil War, workers began to fight for better living and working conditions from the companies they and their families had worked for since arriving in Chicago. The community of Bridgeport, near Back of the Yards, where Irish Chicagoans called home, was the center of the beginnings of a fight for labor unions. Workers from Bridgeport struck for an 8-hour workday, but still did not have power within the organizations where they worked. Labor unions continued to grow in strength, including the Knights of Labor, and they met in Bridgeport. The gains made by unions, however, were rarely enforced. Another avenue to be found to affect the change of the working man and woman, and politics was the answer. Following Clan na Gael and union organizing, political activism was the next natural step. John Patrick Hopkins won election to mayor of the city of Chicago in 1893, making him the first Irish Catholic mayor of Chicago. The Democratic machine was born. Though the following mayors for the next few decades were non-Irish Catholics, they knew to win they had to have the support of the Irish aldermen in Bridgeport. The relationship benefited both sides. With mayors catering to the aldermen of Bridgeport, the aldermen were able to promote the interests of their communities. The first Bridgeport citizen to become mayor of Chicago, Edward J. Kelly, was the son of immigrants from Galway. Kelly was elected in 1933 and led Chicago through the Depression and World War II. Martin Kennelly of Bridgeport followed Kelly, serving 2 terms as mayor. The most famous Bridgeport mayors, however, were Richard J. Daley and his son, Richard Michael Daley. Richard J. Daley's father and mother had been born in County Wexford. By the time Daley was elected mayor of Chicago, he had already been a state senator for 25 years. Daley would lead the city of Chicago for 21 years, and his son would run it for 22. From nearly the beginning of the city of Chicago, Irish immigrants and their descendants formed and shaped the city that it is today. Some of the broadest shoulders of the city of Chicago belong to the people who came to America in search for a better life from Ireland. They made their mark on the city through their religion, with their desire to establish a community through Catholicism, and they made their mark on their city through political activism. Those who came from unspeakable oppression, poverty, found the American dream in Chicago. They were not alone in the pursuit, but they made their mark on Chicago.